So as said, my name is Ryan Duitman. I'm with the University of Arizona. I do manage our regulated research program. We provide services to campus researchers who are working with controlled data. Primarily, we service researchers working with controlled and classified information, CUI, but oftentimes, as we all know, CUI is also combined with ITAR, so we do that as well. And then we also support some HIPAA, PHI research. And just as a kind of a disclaimer, this presentation is not going to be technical. I can spell Linux, but that's about it. So if you have any technical questions, come see me. We can hook you up with some of our technical folks. But this is just going to be about our journey and our processes, lessons learned along that way. So to start off, I'll just do a quick summary of the services that we offer. I'll talk about how we got started on this journey towards supporting CUI on HPC. We'll talk about our project timeline, some of the critical controls that we came across through our process, and then the lessons learned. So to start off, like many people, we had the 2017 mandate to support CUI. So we started our march towards CUI support in mid-2016 under a different project manager at that time. And at the same time, our IT unit was going through cloud deployments. And so we moved towards a cloud-first initiative for IT, and hence the same for CUI. We did investigate on-prem, but that came up with a host of other controls for physical controls. And so that program decided to move to AWS GovCloud, where we utilize EC2 and S3 primarily, but we also have Cisco networking appliances, virtual appliances in AWS GovCloud. We deployed a separate Active Directory as well, completely separate from our enterprise Active Directory, utilizing the same naming convention for usernames, but a different password associated with those. That will be a key part in one of the lessons, some of the lessons learned later on. And that was where we stood for about 6 years with those services. And in February, or around February of 2023, we launched our GCC High service. So how did we get started? First of all, our researchers were utilizing DoD HPC systems. If anyone's ever used a DoD HPC system, that requires sponsorship. That's often hard to get those sponsorships. And then, of course, moving large amounts of data to DoD systems was tedious and slow. So we had some researchers, some faculty researchers on campus who submitted a proposal, internal proposal, to our Office of the Provost for some funding to create a cluster for supporting CUI. That proposal was not funded internally, and so they began to look for external sources. And they submitted a proposal with the Navy for some funding to do this. That required us to do some requirements gathering, of course, with the researchers. At that time, the question was whether or not GPUs were going to be important to their particular workflow. Fortunately, it wasn't, because that would have eaten up all of our budget. So this cluster does not have GPUs in it. But one of the key pieces that we put into this proposal was people time. Oftentimes when we submit these proposals, all we get is hardware out of it, but it takes people to manage these as well. So we put some people time into it. Obviously, we went through the quoting process and the creation of the budget. We handed that information over to the researchers, they submitted, and then we waited. And we waited, and we waited for quite some time. So we were actually awarded. As I mentioned, in our timeline, this was mid-2022, where we put this proposal together. Towards the end of 2022, we got a notification of the award, and we had a kickoff meeting for our project. We spent the next bit of time working on ordering of systems, getting all that prepared and getting those orders submitted. And in March of 2023, we started the compliance march. As many know in this room, CUI has a metric ton of documentation associated with it. And it is actually probably the longest part of any project is preparing that documentation. So we started that documentation. That involved folks from my team, our security analyst, that involved our cloud folks because we did have to integrate some pieces with the cloud, and it involved our HPC systems administrators as well. We don't have a GRC system, and so we keep our documentation in a wiki, and that helps us manage that amount of documentation. So after ordering the equipment and waiting for that to show up, that equipment did show, and instead of keeping them in boxes on the floor, we just racked and stacked that hardware. And as we were continuing through our compliance documentation, when we got to sections about networking and communications and system security in that area, we realized that our original thought for our firewall was not going to meet the requirements. And so we had to go back and reevaluate our firewall and VPN appliances. And we had to purchase some additional software as well. During this time, we also integrated with our authentication system. This is where we utilized that existing Active Directory that we had in our AWS GovCloud. So a better part of a year spent on documentation and some of the preliminary hardware configuration. As we got further into in early 2025, as we were getting through most of the documentation, we began to start our security configurations. This is our firewalls, our port configurations, integrating with our SIEM, getting alerts set up, getting reports set up. And after we did all that, we get our software installed. Part of that is software needs ports open, and so we had to figure out which ports those were, make those configurations in our firewall. Then in May of this year, we started to do testing of the environments. One of the things that we did, and this is one of the lessons learned, was we had users on the system, but we didn't allow a CUI on it at first. And we wanted to test the environments, see what users were going to do, what ports needed to be open that weren't already open. We didn't want any accidental spillages or breaches of data, so we didn't allow any CUI on those systems. Then we had a go-live checklist, and on our go-live checklist were things like ensuring that FIPS encryption was enabled, make sure that we were able to collect the right kinds of logs. We were testing our egress rules, which we discovered we needed to open some more things up. We tested file permissions. We validated pseudo access and the limitations around controls around limiting that pseudo access. Validating port restrictions and validating VPN access. And so in July of this year, we went live with our HPC system. Live with, I think there were 5 users to start off with. So what were some of the critical controls that we ran across? Obviously, access and authentication is a critical family of controls, and we were able to utilize many of the existing controls that we had already written for our AWS environment because we were using the same Active Directory. We did have to make some minor adjustments for HPC specific use cases, but primarily we were able to utilize existing controls there. But really important to pay attention to those controls. Media protection. Since we were in the cloud, we didn't have a lot of media protections. We had to write some additional media protections to meet the HPC meet the requirements for HPC. Again, because we were in the cloud, physical protections. Yeah, we had physical protections on offices and on labs, but that's different than having physical protections on your data center where you're hosting your servers. Fortunately, we had some pretty strong physical protections already in place, and we have a separate data center for research than our enterprise data center. So it was easier to adopt those controls. If you have to share your data center with an enterprise environment, pay close attention to your physical controls there. Configuration management. This is where you're going to have your baseline configurations. Obviously in HPC, because of the size of systems, you have some automated controls around configurations. We use Werewolf in our environment. And so just making sure that your baseline configurations are documented well. Least privilege access is also critical. In our case, we have HPC admins, so they have more rights than most. We have standard users, of course, who don't have many accesses at all. And then we have this group in the middle, which we call our research facilitators. And in our case, these facilitators are the ones that do software installation. And so we had to give them some limited pseudo access in order to install applications. We don't allow our users, our standard users, to install applications, although they can install on their home directory. But any system-wide applications have to go through our central office, where they're reviewed before installation, and then our research facilitators install the applications. You have to pay close attention to ports and protocols and services, making sure that you limit those to only your necessary services and ports. The next set of controls, family of controls that's really critical, are going to be your security and communication protection controls. This is where your encryption comes into play. Normally, in our HPC environments, well, we're not a Red Hat shop. So normally in our HPCs, we run Rocky Linux, which our team really wanted to run in this environment, but unfortunately, Rocky at the time was not FIPS validated. So then we had to search for FIPS validated operating system, and we decided to go with Oracle Linux because it was FIPS validated. We had to create all of our diagrams, all of our data flow diagrams and architectural diagrams. And then, of course, the firewall rules, which we saved towards the end of our deployment because we wanted to understand more about the software, the users and their use cases, and documenting these ports and services that need to be open. And then the last set of controls that are pretty critical to think about are your system and information integrity controls. This is where virus and malware scanning come into play. And we debated for quite some time what to do about this control. Because obviously running antivirus on terabytes or petabytes of data, you would be running that all the time. And you'd be eating up a lot of processor time for that. So one of the things that we do right now is on our HPC systems, we run RK Hunter, which we use for rootkit detection. And then all of those logs are ingested into our scene. We run AID as well for unauthorized host level configuration changes against our baseline. And AID, those logs are ingested into our scene. We have Audit D running for logging any unauthorized accesses and other things, and those logs are ingested into our scene. And then we require that any data coming from outside of the environment has to be scanned prior to ingesting it into our HPC. So we have secure endpoints that we hand out to researchers, and then they have to scan prior to transferring that data into the HPC. We have an end-user agreement that they sign that they say in that end-user agreement that they agree to scanning before uploading into HPC. This will probably end up being a point of contention with an assessor when we get to that phase, so we'll see how well that goes. But that's where we are right now. That's how we have written our controls. So let's talk about lessons learned. What have we learned from this process? Like everything else with CUI, the documentation of controls and procedures takes the longest time. In our case, it took a year, and with that, we were even able to utilize some of our existing controls, and it still took us that amount of time. Lesson learned is reuse as many of your existing controls as you can. In our case, we reutilized a lot of existing controls in our identity and authentication controls with Active Directory. And, we were able to utilize a lot of the physical controls from our data center and some of our risk controls. We were able to utilize those. We had to make some adjustments to our incident response plan to account for HPC, but a majority of the incident response plan we could also utilize. So look for ways where you can utilize those existing controls to help ease the burden of documenting for an HPC. Of course, researchers, once they hear there's an HPC and for them to use on CUI, they're going to be very excited about it and anxious to get on the system. And so one of the things that we did is we tried to keep them well informed along the process. In the beginning, it was just kind of keeping them informed where we were with our controls and our control documentation. And as we got further along in the process and closer to the go-live date, we met more frequently with our researchers. So keep them well informed. As I had mentioned earlier, we allowed our researchers to get onto the system before authorizing any CUI. This was a great opportunity to test whether or not the scheduler would work for them. It gave us an opportunity to test software and applications and making sure that ports were open. It also allowed us to do a lot of just testing before any CUI, again, so you don't have any accidental disclosures of information. Take time to adjust any URL or port filtering. We took a couple of weeks just validating, verifying, scanning packets, seeing what needed to be open and what URLs needed to be open. Our firewall does allow us to do URL filtering, It also, our firewall also allows us to do geolocation controls as well, so geofencing, which is great to be able to have. And then, one of the last probably big lesson learned here is to draft your system and communication protection and your system and information integrity family of controls. This is where your communication controls are going to be. Be sure you draft those before deciding what firewall appliance to buy, because you may find that you may need some different capabilities in your firewall. That was, we thought we needed, early on, we had picked a firewall out and then realized that it didn't meet all of the needs of the controls. Unfortunately, at this point, the budget was already set in the grant, and so we had to take some budget from our people time area in order to cover the increased costs for the firewall. So do that earlier so that you can get the right firewall, get the right amount into your budget. So where we stand now is we are live. We have 5 or 6 people that are utilizing the system right now. Some things that we're still encountering is getting data into the environments. It's still working through those complications and difficulties. Like I said, we have some secure endpoints, so data can come through those. We have our AWS environment, so coming in through S3. We have a secure application that we built on top of that to relate and communicate with S3. And then GCC High. All of that, most of that's done through a web browser, and doing that through an X window and on HPC has some complications associated with that and some slowness and difficulty. So we're still working through those things. And we're continuing to learn as we go along. So that's what I had prepared, and if there are any questions, happy to try to answer. Yeah, so we don't have any sort of automated expansion there. Really, the connection from our HPC to AWS is for obtaining data out of our AWS environments, pushing data back into it. So if they need to do some calculations and then they need to write a report about those, getting that data into AWS so they can use their virtual machine to write their report. But outside of, we don't have any sort of automatic expansion for burst capabilities or anything along that line.
Hello, Phil from Scenic. You kind of alluded to, and you didn't say explicitly, about maybe having a challenge with the control of the data scanning prior to ingestion. And I was wondering if, one, there was an actual challenge that you were trying to possibly address with getting those things recorded properly, and if you had considered or found any challenges in doing any automated recording of that on the desktop side, because it sounded like you own the endpoint, secure endpoint that's being used. And did you look at automated recording of the activity to do that for you so you didn't have to rely on the person manually recording that activity?
No, we haven't looked into that. We do collect the logs from those secure endpoints, so when scanning is happening there, those logs would be captured, but we haven't built any sort of automated tools to validate that scanning. That's a good idea.
You mentioned it briefly, but I was wondering if you could share any more of the stories related to the challenges you had with physical controls.
Yeah, so our data center, so we have a separate research data center, And one of the controls so with our data center, we did allow individuals to come in escorted for tours of the data center. And once we started putting controlled data into that environment, one of the controls we put in place is we stopped those kinds of tours of the data center. Fortunately, we have two sides of our data center are made out of glass windows, so we could do those tours externally, but we did have to add that in place. Our data center currently also is card access, so we just had to make sure that the controls in those card access scans were being monitored and reviewed. And so that was some of the additional controls we had to put in.
Hello, I am Vishal from Indiana University. I have two questions. First, what are the practical challenges you faced in configuration baselining? And second thing, how do you ensure that the cloud is not becoming a dumping ground for storage of data? Like how you maintain that it's economical?
Yeah, so baseline configurations, we do a periodic review of those baseline configurations just to make sure that they still meet all the requirements. And then as far as extraneous data being pushed into AWS, is that where you were going? Yeah, so the AWS resources are funded by the project themselves. And so they pay those costs. And so they're careful about what data they put out there because they're charged for that. Fortunately, S3 isn't terribly, it's not as expensive as EBS. And so as long as you push it into S3, costs are more manageable than in EBS or some of the other storage solutions.
Clark Gaylord from George Washington University. Apologize for the follow-up question, but great talk. I'm curious if you're planning on putting this into an external report this is how I did it. The community, I think, would love such a thing.
Yes, we actually are. Part of the project is to write a white paper about this. I was telling my boss about coming here, and he was like, "Well, this is a great start to the white paper." So yes, we will be producing one.
We're running out of time for questions, so we're going to thank Ryan for presenting.